Hey you guys, today for Reading Workshop we are going to be focusing on scrutinizing, which means looking at, paying attention to, and close reading, and not skipping those descriptive parts in your story. You know it's all something that we all do, and we have to stop doing it. And that's what we're going to be learning today for a Reading Workshop. Something that a lot of people don't know about me is that my mother was an English major in college, so reading was just a part of my life when I was growing up. And it was a difficult part of my life because my mother loved reading so much and she expected the same from us. One of the things that drives me nuts, or actually drove me insane in stories, are those descriptive parts in a story. You know those parts in the story when the plot slows down, the action tends to slow down a bit, and then they start describing things into almost like a painstaking kind of way. One thing I used to do when I was an earlier reader is I would skip those parts. And I would sit there and think that they weren't really important. And that was until I was doing a lot of reading with my mom. And my mom would find that those parts were the most important parts in the entire story. And she would get so much from it. I remember we would sit there and we'd be reading a story on some historical item. Let's say it was on the Dust Bowl. And she would start talking about how the wind blew across the plains and how the sand would get into every little nook and cranny. And she would be using all these descriptive words and all these similes and metaphors. And she would turn to me and say, "Doesn't that just create such an amazing image in your mind of what it was like to be back then?" And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, Mom, that was totally it. Because I never paid attention to it. I skipped it to what I thought were more important parts. And then I came to realize that if I was going to truly understand of what life was like in the Dust Bowl and what it was like to live in these plains during this time, those descriptive parts in historical fiction, those parts that we all think are so boring, are actually the most important parts in the story. And those are the parts that we need to slow down and go back and reread, not once, not twice, but maybe even 3 times, because that's where you're going to get your information, and that's where your comprehension is really going to come from. So that brings us to today's teaching point, and that is when the plot slows down, when you have those descriptive moments that come up, this is an opportunity to slow down as a reader and to really soak up those details that the author inserted so you could better imagine this place and this time period. There's actually a reason why they're putting that in there, why they're being so descriptive. It's not to bore you, it's actually to inform you and to educate you. I'm going to go back to this book that I've been reading, Number the Stars. And by the way, for those of you that have come to me with interest to read this book, I have put a PDF of this in Schoology in the book clubs. You'll see it there. But we're going to start here. Chapter 3, Where is Mrs. Hirsch? Now, right away, this doesn't seem to be like an action-filled passage. It actually looks like one of those passages that I would normally kind of skip right through. But I'm not going to do that. This is going to be one of these moments that I'm going to close read this passage. I'm going to slow down as a reader to really absorb the information, to understand what life was like back then. I want to imagine life, right? Now, so far, the characters live in an apartment building, right, with the Johansons. And they're on the 3rd floor, and the Rosens are on the 2nd floor, right below them. The neighborhood's pretty bright and sunny. There's a lot of people standing around on the corners and in their doorways. And there's been a woman that's been watching Anne-Marie and Ellen interacting with that German Nazi soldier. There are a lot of shops nearby in this small town, and there are 2 Nazi soldiers on every single corner. So that's just a little background information for you as far as this story goes. So let's start there and let's do a little bit of reading. And I want you to really imagine in your mind's eye what life was like back then, really putting yourself in there and scrutinizing this descriptive section. The days of September passed, one after the other, much the same. Anne Marie and Ellen walked to school together and home again, always now taking the longer way, avoiding the tall soldier and his partner. Christy dawdled just behind them or scampered ahead, just never out of their sight. I'm not going to lie to you, just reading this little paragraph, I'm getting a little foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is like my spider senses are starting to tingle, right? Of something that's going to happen later on. Because the author just keeps talking about how the girls are doing their normal thing. They're just walking to and from school, they're avoiding the soldier, blah, 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 blah. I don't know about you, but when the author is making a big deal about that in a chapter, especially at the start of a chapter, that tells me some foreshadowing. I have a feeling, my spider senses are starting to tingle, that trouble is ahead. Now, I'm also sitting there thinking that after I read this little paragraph, you're probably thinking, they're not saying anything at all, right? I think something different. I actually think there's a lot being said here. I mean, think about it for a second. They're talking about how life goes on as normal, right? And that's on the surface. Life is going on at normal. But I'm thinking that underneath that surface of what is called normal life, that there's a lot of like fear and nervousness going on in this town. It's very similar to how maybe some of you may act, where we kind of have a feeling that you're not feeling quite yourself, and we'll ask you about it, and you're like, no, I'm fine. It's almost like the tears of a clown, right? The clown's supposed to be happy, but they're crying on the inside. Same thing going on in this town. So let's continue to read on, and we're going to stop to really notice even the tiniest, smallest details about the setting, the time, the place, and about the characters' different reactions to it. Let's see if this is the sunny city neighborhood with people standing in the doorways that I pictured initially when I started talking to you. The two mothers still had their coffee together in the afternoons. They began to knit mittens as days grew slightly shorter and the first leaves began to fall from the trees, because another winter was coming. Everyone remembered the last one. There was no fuel now for the homes and apartments in Copenhagen, and the winter nights were terribly cold. Like the other families in their building, though Johanssons had opened the old chimney and installed a little stove to use for heat when they could find coal to burn. Mama used it too, sometimes for cooking, because the electricity was rationed now. At night they used candles for light. Sometimes Ellen's father, a teacher, complained in frustration because he couldn't see in the dim light to correct his children's papers. Soon we'll have to add another blanket to your bed, Mama said one morning as she and Anne-Marie tidied the bedroom. Chrissy and I are lucky to have each other for warmth in the winter, Anne-Marie said. Poor Ellen, to have no sisters. She'll have to snuggle in with her Mama and Papa when it gets cold, Mama said, smiling. I don't know about you guys, but I now am getting a feeling that it's not going to be life as normal. Matter of fact, it seems like Anne-Marie and Ellen are going to be bracing for a very, very cold winter. One thing that I did in my book, and I'm going to show you an example, is I went ahead and I close read, and I highlighted phrases or words that told me it was going to be a really cold winter. Let me show you. So take a look at what I did. I highlighted key words or phrases that gave me a clue that Anne-Marie and Ellen were bracing for an extremely cold winter. This is the first page. I had highlighted several things. Knit mittens, right? The first leaves began to fall from the trees. There was no fuel for the homes and the apartments, and the winter nights were terribly cold. The other family opened up the old chimney and installed a little stove to use for heat when they could find coal to burn. Electricity was rationed. That means that you're not allowed to use as much. So if you don't have electricity, That's going to also lead to having a very cold winter. Let me show you some other phrases that I found. They were talking about adding another blanket to a bed, to Anne-Marie's bed. Christy and her sister were going to have to snuggle with each other for warmth in the winter, use their body heat to stay warm. And then they were concerned here that Ellen wasn't going to have anyone to snuggle with, and Mama said that she's going to have to snuggle with her mom and her father, to help stay warm. These were all clues that it's going to be a very cold winter. And this is an example of what close reading is. When we talk about close reading, it's not necessarily about reading a passage 5 or 6 times, but it's about reading it slowly and picking out pieces of information that's going to be helpful. If you are reading a descriptive paragraph, it's helpful to highlight key phrases so that way you can bring them to your book club as evidence. This is what's important. So you guys, as you're reading your historical fiction book clubs or your historical fiction books, I don't want you to be that kind of reader anymore that when you come across a descriptive part that you just skip over it as being boring, because that's going to be the most important part that you actually have to read. That's where you're going to get most of your information. And that's when you want to stop and you really want to close read that section and find out what's really happening in that part. And that way you can bring this back to your book club and you can discuss those descriptive parts with so much more ways to build on each other's conversations and to hold a better book club discussion. So please make this a focus in your independent work. Please make this a focus to bring it up in your book club discussions, because not only is it going to enrich your discussions, and of course, yes, it's one of the standards that we are focused on, but it's about you becoming a better comprehender and having better book club discussions and being able to enjoy reading that much more. Good luck.